In the final part of the lecture, I'm going to tell you about my experience as a member of the jury of the Chopin competition in a section of the lecture called Hearing Shape. I'd like to say before we begin that hearing is something that is so absolutely vital to the musician and indeed to those who listen to music. And when I mean hearing, I mean a kind of visceral understanding of music. It's implied by a comment, a very pithy comment made by Arnold Schoenberg many decades ago when he said that the ear is the basis of the musician's Verständnis. It could be in many things, but say understanding for the moment. The ear is the basis of the musician's understanding. Indeed, how we hear music is critical to how we project it and how we understand it when it comes to us. I often say, as I did in my Leipzig masterclass in 2017, that you really need to hear, to listen to what is going on. And that has to do with this point I made earlier, that every note, every phrase, every element has to have a role, an identity, a shape, a purpose, and so forth. When you can hear it like that, in that assimilated way, you'll have the capacity to project music with far more meaning for yourself and indeed potentially for other people. So it's something to bear in mind as a general point as we start this next phase of the lecture. So after initial thoughts, analyzing shape, inferring shape from the score, we now hear shape. The Chopin competition took place in October 2015. There were 3 rounds, as you can see here, with the finals taking place at the end. 77 contestants in the first round, 43 in the second, 20 in the third round, and then 10 in the finals. Each finalist had to play one of the concertos by Chopin. In the case of the other rounds, there were recitals of various lengths with different sorts of repertoires expected, with scores ranging from 1 low to 25 high, given by individual jury members and then compiled at the end of each round by the organizers. I was on the jury, which is shown here in the Warsaw Philharmonic. This is me right there. You can recognize me by my distinctive head, perhaps, and there are other jury members surrounding, including, say, Marta Argerich, who's down here, Garrick Olsen, I think, is here, and so forth. What we had to do in this vast space was listen to Chopin recital after Chopin recital. In the case of the first round, 16 Chopin recitals per day over 5 days. It was exhausting work. Every single piece played by every single contestant has to be understood in its own terms. And so trying to get to know the personalities of individual pieces and individual pianists in this kind of succession, one after the other, is immensely challenging work. I took it very seriously and indeed took notes throughout, as you'll see, not for any purpose other than to record my thoughts as I went along. It helps me to crystallize my reactions. You're going to see some of those notes in a minute. Now, the jury members are given very little guidance in the rules as to what they are supposed to do. The rules say simply that the task of the jury is to assess the interpretative skills of each participant in the competition, taking especially into account the challenges which Frédéric Chopin's music poses to pianists, and to award prizes and distinctions to the best competitors. Well, that's fine, but what do you really make of that? How are you going to proceed as a member of the jury in deciding who is better than the next person or the person before? What are your criteria? I spent a lot of time thinking about this. What was I listening for? How was I listening? And so forth. And I've just published a study which, in fact, records some of the criteria and experiences that I had, a study called Judging Chopin, Evaluation of Musical Experience. It was released just a few weeks ago, in fact, in a book called Investigating Musical Performance. And I'm going to present some of the material from it with respect to one particular case study performance, which I've talked about an awful lot in the last few years, because I found it particularly striking on the one hand, and also particularly valuable as a demonstration of some of the points that, in fact, we've been discussing today. As the competition progressed, I took part in many different interviews, and those are very, very helpful because I was frequently asked, what are you listening for and how are you listening? In the article that I've just shown to you and in the comments that follow, I'm going to draw upon three particular interviews. A portrait filmed in Cambridge before the competition in June 2015, one during the competition on a Sunday afternoon just before going into the next round of recitals, and then an interview that took place in the early days of the competition, published in the daily Chopin Courier. In the third of those interviews, the last that I've just mentioned, I was asked, how do you listen? And I said to the person interviewing me, Mr. Komanitsky, that I had sort of listening questions in my mind, even though I didn't deliberately respond to them in a sort of systematic way. First, well, generally, what is the pianist doing? What's going on? What is he or she trying to get across? What have they found in the music, which may be something I've never found for myself? How does the pianist relate thematic statements, or indeed anything else, that may be 10 minutes apart, 5 minutes apart? What sense of connection is that? Are they identical statements, or do they differ from each other meaningfully and effectively? Think about it. If somebody does something here and then the music comes back later and there's no connection, is that deliberate, or does it show that they're not really thinking, that there's no large-scale planning? You have to decide. How does the pianist move from idea to idea? Is there coherence in the progression, or, as I've said, is it more arbitrary? And finally, what kind of expressive approach is taken, and how is it maintained or manipulated across the piece? Now, as I said a second ago, this is not a checklist that I had in front of me that I ticked off and went through as each person played each piece. But these are the sorts of issues that I was weighing up in deciding who should get a higher mark than the other. It's actually a very difficult process. You want to be consistent in your criteria and to be fair to those who are sometimes very idiosyncratic, and particularly those whose performances you may not like, but you might respect. I always challenge my students when they respond to a question. I play a recording and I say, what do you hear? And they say, I like it, or I don't like it. I say, I don't care whether you like it or don't like it. I don't particularly care. I want to know what you think is going on. What is happening? What sense is made by the performers in question? Think hard about the particular approach taken, the logic behind it, the musical architecture, by which I mean process or shape. All of that is right at the heart of what I think we should be doing as listeners. It's so much more interesting than whether you just like it or don't like it. So ultimately, in retrospect, I thought of three principal qualities that I was looking for when I judged the pianist. These are my own qualities. And as I said, this came after the fact. I didn't have these in front of me during the competition. The first was outstanding pianistic ability. These pianists had to be superb as executants in order to do well. The standard was extremely high throughout the competition. Secondly, they had to have what I call some sort of deep understanding of Chopin. Now, that can vary considerably according to the artistic personality of the musicians in question, but there still needs to be some sense of deep connection with Chopin, whatever that means. And I really did put the accent on whatever that means, because it can be very flexible, even though it's also very core. The third point is an imaginative and uniquely personal assimilation of the music, a sense of ownership. And this, to me, is vital. Because you could imagine training yourself to imitate Chopin or some great Chopin pianist, and you might have outstanding ability, but you don't have a personal message to put across. You're just a kind of imitator, a kind of museum piece. That's not enough. You need all three of these together in varying proportions according to who you are, what you're doing, and so forth. And I had a very flexible approach in some ways, even though I also looked for this kind of core, however that might be defined. Now, what I'm going to do is to talk about a performance, which, as I said, I've discussed many times and have written about in this article, a performance I found quite fascinating, of a pianist who was found fascinating by many people in the competition. He was a pianist who excited a range of strong reaction from those who loved him and those who did not like him at all. Some people thought he manipulated Chopin, other people thought that he put his finger right on the kind of inner message. What we're going to do now is listen to Georgas Osokins, a Latvian pianist who performed in the first round the etude in B minor, opus 25, number 10. We're going to listen to it, and then I'm going to show you the notes that I took when I first heard the piece in the competition and discuss those before considering how the performance itself was shaped by the pianist in question. I hope you'll agree with me that whether you like it or not, is a very striking performance. I was certainly struck by it as I heard it in the competition itself, which I think was on the fourth day of the first round, third or fourth day in the evening. These are my notes, which are pretty much illegible, I accept. As I said a minute ago, I took notes throughout the competition, simply because that's what I do always when I'm in this kind of context. Just to help you out, I'll transcribe the notes about this particular performance, which are shown there. And what we read is the following: sensational. He brings out the inner suspension figure very prominently. This ja-dum, ja-dum. Huge panache at the end of the first section. Great tone. Middle section, sound. I love the sound. The theme, more straight at first. The second incarnation, very superb pedaling. He makes it painful, but then releases that pain. The transition back to the recapitulation is indulgent, a bit unusual. That's all I wrote. Now, in fact, these notes are somewhat misleading because one of the most striking features of the performance is not recorded in the notes at all. I'm going to tell you about that in a second. And indeed, one other thing that's not recorded in the notes is anything to do with the ending of the piece, because I was bowled over. I was swept off my feet by the way in which this piece ended. And I'm going to say more about that in a second. So the notes are not the full picture, but they do help us get a handle on what I was hearing. Remember that this is one performance happening in a series of recitals. You don't have time to stop and think very, very hard about how you reacted to the music or what the person is doing. You've got to do this as a lightning reaction, and yet it's got to be based upon some sort of defensible set of criteria, the ones that I tried to mention earlier. I found in thinking about this afterwards that my notes divided into three broad areas of consideration: pianistic factors, expressive characteristics, and musical process. So the pianistic factors such as sound and tone, articulation, pedaling, expressive mood, indulgence, originality, some general features. And then with respect to musical process, I think my slide is stuck. With respect to musical process, tempo, rubato, dynamics, contrapuntal layering, melodic shape, harmonic shape, and the overall shape, building from start panache to straight, then varied, painful pedaling, leading to resolution. These are many other factors, in fact, that we saw before with respect to musical shape in general. Here in the notes, there are comments alluding to or specifically about these elements of musical process. Let's look at the score of this piece. This is the French first edition, published on our website, Chopin's First Editions Online. Now, you see here the end of the introduction at the beginning of this excerpt, and then the main body of the piece beginning. And what this pianist, Yorgos Sokins, did that I found so striking immediately, which I didn't mention in the notes, is that he pulls back right at the end of this phrase. He retracts completely. And I was very, very struck by this. I said, oh my God, why did he do that? It's certainly not marked in the score. What was he trying to do? And I remembered this later on as the piece progressed, because it made such an initial impression upon me. So I was immediately asking, what is he going to do with this striking effect? And then he brings out that inner suspension figure, as I said, very prominently, to the point of anticipating it within the texture. Now, that I did mention in the notes, but not the ending of this first phrase. Now, the music comes back an octave higher, and indeed, Sokins followed the same pattern. He pulled right back at the end of this phrase. He then brings out those inner suspension figures prominently. So I've heard this kind of retraction twice, and I'm now thinking, will he do this again at the end of the piece when the music returns after the middle section? So I planted that in the back of my mind, thinking, what is he going to do with this? I also, of course, was thinking, what is he going to do with these inner suspension figures, and so forth. This is a diagram of the piece, which I prepared after the fact. Again, of course, I didn't have this in front of me. We have the introduction, then that A section that I showed first, and then the one an octave higher, after which there's the codetto, where we have the huge panache mentioned in my notes. You have a B section, a varied version of it, and then a contrasting C section. The B material comes back, and then the C, and then the B. It's a kind of ternary form with repeats. And then a second codetta leading to another form of introduction coming back to the original material, which is stated twice but with a very different ending. This is a very typical sort of pattern for Chopin's etudes, and indeed other pieces by him, a ternary form with variants. Now, in the case of O'Sawkins, shown here, my notes shown here, what we find in this first listening, what I found in my first listening, was a set of features that formed the basis of his strategy, his performance strategy, a play between retraction and surge, and a foregrounding of the contrapuntal writing, especially the inner parts. I've designated that as C in the diagram, retraction as R, and surge as S. So at the end of this first section, we have the first retraction, followed by those inner suspension figures. Up an octave, retraction, and then surge, the huge panache mentioned in my notes. Now you get a sense of the shape already of this first section by these simple, somewhat crude hairpin diagrams. We then proceed in the middle section to contrapuntal foregrounding throughout the inner parts, then real retraction, this C section when it comes back. He holds back the tempo, becomes very quiet, very inward. It becomes haunting, frightening almost. And when the B section comes back, again, he pulls back to the point of almost annihilating the musical presence. It retracts into nothingness almost, this somewhat unusual transition leading back through the introduction to the return. Now remember that I heard the retraction twice. I have a sense of a pattern in my mind. What am I going to get in the recapitulation? Another retraction? No. What O'Sawkins does here is brilliantly to reverse the pattern, and he takes off in the same place. The ending of that phrase takes off. It gets louder and faster and more energetic, and that serves as the springboard for this final section where he goes off the edge in terms of energy. So what we have here in this diagram and what we had in the performance was the kind of breathing, if you will, through retraction and surge with a kind of underlay of contrapuntal undulation, of foregrounding, the parts coming and going in and out and so forth. And I responded very favorably to this performance because I thought, first of all, there was a real mind at work, a real plan in action over the course of the 4.5 minutes that it lasts, as represented by these retractions and surges, this play of expressive mood and color. And I was also impressed by the fact that Chopin himself reserved for the endings of pieces a surge of energy in many cases. And I felt that what O'Sawkins did here was, in essence, put his finger on a key part of Chopin's aesthetic through the contrapuntal foregrounding, certainly, but also in terms of the overall shape, the overall flow of energy. So I felt that although this is an idiosyncratic performance, which has features that maybe I wouldn't recommend to everybody, I nevertheless felt that it showed a deep understanding of Chopin as well as outstanding ability and a personal assimilation. So this scored very highly in my notes, and indeed in my memory, as a performance that really did capture much of what there is at stake here. Whether you like it or not, it's something to understand in terms of these properties. Let's listen to it one more time with this diagram in front of us. it's very hard to capture in words a performance like that, but I've tried, and I'm going to go a little bit further, reviewing these notes again, and in particular, this section of the notes, the musical process. What we hear, in short, is not just musical process, but the musical shape of the performance and musical shape in the performance. These various elements that I described earlier, that I mentioned in various capacities, modeled in different ways by different people, now put into action by this young pianist in a way that I think makes sense in itself, makes sense with regard to Chopin, and is an exciting artistic statement in its own right. What we see here, what we hear in this case, is shape in action. We hear shape taking place over time. And so we end the lecture, and I'll bring back this kinematic interpretation, thanking you for your time and your attention. And I would like ultimately to underscore the importance of this notion, which I've tried to demonstrate throughout my comments today. It's something I hope that you'll think about, something that you'll consider putting into action in your own performances on whatever occasion they may take place, whatever composer you happen to be playing, and whatever the audience might be, whether it's the Chopin competition jury or any other audience you might encounter. Thank you again, and goodbye.